Why did this canine dog suddenly lunge at an abandoned container? What happened next was unthinkable. Mafia, or whatever, I'm not afraid. Margaret declared, her voice firm despite her trembling hands as she stood between the armed thugs and the wounded man. Blitz, hold them! In an instant, the retired K-9 launched forward, a black blur of fury disabling the men who threatened them. With a dying witness revealing he'd stolen crucial documents, Margaret and Blitz were suddenly tangled in a deadly conspiracy far bigger than they could imagine. To hear what happens next in this incredible story of courage, subscribe, like, and listen to the full episode. The Calumet River District of Southeast Chicago is where steel skeletons go to die. Under a sliver of moon, the abandoned industrial park was a graveyard of silent machinery and forgotten purpose. A bitter November wind carrying the ghost of smelted iron and the damp scent of the nearby river snaked through a canyon of rust-streaked shipping containers. It was a place for rats and memories, not for a 72-year-old woman and her dog. But Margaret Riley was here, her worn woolen coat pulled tight, the crisp air biting at her cheeks. Her steps, aided by a sturdy oak cane, were slow but steady. Beside her, a magnificent German shepherd named Blitz moved with a predator's grace, his black coat absorbing the dim light. A slight, almost imperceptible limp in his front left leg was the only sign that he was anything less than perfect. He stayed close, his amber eyes scanning the oppressive shadows, a silent, vigilant guardian. "Just a bit further, boy," Margaret murmured, her breath a small white cloud. "Mrs. Gable said she saw some kids messing around with the fence here. Best we make sure they didn't leave it open for strays to get in." Suddenly, Blitz froze. A low guttural growl rumbled deep in his chest, a sound Margaret hadn't heard in years. The fur along his spine bristled. Before she could speak his name, he shot forward, a black streak against the corroded landscape. He didn't bark. He moved with a chilling, focused intensity, his powerful paws churning the gravel as he zeroed in on a single container at the end of a long, dark row. He slammed into the corrugated steel door with his full weight, the impact echoing with a dull boom. He began to claw at it, his nails screeching against the metal, his growls escalating into sharp, frantic barks. "Blitz, heel!" Margaret commanded, her voice sharp with alarm. He ignored her completely, his entire being fixated on the sealed box. Panic fluttered in Margaret's chest. This wasn't the quiet, retired companion she knew. This was K-9 Unit 7, the working dog, the hunter. Heart pounding, she hobbled closer, her cane sinking into the soft earth. "Blitz, enough." As she reached him, a sound from within the container stopped her cold. It was faint, nearly lost in the wind, and the dog's barking, but it was unmistakable. A human moan, a weak, desperate sound of pain. Margaret's blood ran cold. She gripped her cane like a weapon. "Is someone in there?" she yelled, her voice trembling but loud. "Answer me!" The only answer was another weaker groan. Before she could process what to do next, twin beams of light sliced through the darkness, pinning them in a harsh glare. A black SUV had silently rolled to the edge of the yard. Two large men emerged, their silhouettes broad and menacing. One of them racked the slide on a handgun, the sound unnaturally loud in the sudden silence. "Step away from the container, old woman." The man with the gun snarled, his voice flat and deadly. "What's inside belongs to us, and he's not coming out alive." Margaret Riley hadn't chosen a life of quiet solitude. It had been thrust upon her. For 45 years, she had been a high school history teacher, her days filled with the loud, vibrant chaos of teenagers, her evenings with grading papers and preparing lessons. Her world was one of fact dates and the slow, inevitable march of time. When her husband, a Chicago PD patrolman named Frank, had died of a heart attack 5 years prior, the silence he left behind in their small South Deering bungalow was deafening. Retirement followed soon after, and the silence grew into an oppressive void. It was a void she tried to fill with routine morning walks, tending to her small garden, volunteering at the local library. It was a life of small moments carefully curated to keep the loneliness at bay. Blitz had entered her life by a stroke of fate a year ago. He was Frank's old partner's dog, a celebrated K-9 officer retired early after catching shrapnel in his shoulder during a warehouse raid. His handler, Officer Miller, was being transferred to a desk job in another state and couldn't take him. No one else on the force had the space or the experience for a high-drive retired police dog. He was destined for a kennel or worse. Remembering Frank's stories of the brilliant, fearless K-9, Margaret had made a call. She had a fenced yard and an abundance of quiet time. She thought they could be lonely together. The dog that arrived was not the fierce warrior of Frank's stories. He was reserved, watchful, and carried a deep sadness in his intelligent eyes. The limp was a constant reminder of the violence that had ended his career. He rarely barked. He never played. He was a professional in forced retirement, a king in exile. They settled into a peaceful coexistence, two veterans of different wars, finding comfort in a shared, unspoken understanding. He was her shadow, her protector, the living, breathing presence that kept the silence from consuming her completely. Now standing in the cold, harsh glare of the SUV's headlights, that peace was shattered. The man's threat hung in the air, a promise of brutal, casual violence that felt utterly alien to her world. She looked from the menacing figures to the container door behind which a human life was fading. She thought of Frank, who had spent his life running toward danger, not away from it. She thought of the vow she'd made to herself after he died to live a life, however small, that he would have been proud of. This was the inciting incident the moment her quiet world collided with a dark and violent reality. It wasn't a single choice, but a cascade of them. Her first choice had been to investigate the noise. Her second was to call out. Now came the third, the one that would define everything that followed. She could obey. She could take her dog walk away and pretend she had seen nothing. She could retreat back into her safe, silent world. Or she could stand her ground. "I don't know who you are," she said, her voice shaking, but finding a core of iron she hadn't known she possessed. "But you are not killing anyone tonight, not on my watch." She planted the tip of her oak cane firmly in the dirt, a feeble line drawn in the sand. The men took a step forward. Blitz, sensing her resolve, lowered his head, a predatory stillness coming over him. He was no longer just her companion. He was her partner. Her goal in that instant became terrifyingly simple: to protect the life in that container. She had no plan. She had no weapon beyond a walking stick and a damaged dog. But in the face of raw evil, her history teacher's mind recalled a simple, unassailable fact. Civilization is built by those who refuse to be bystanders, and Margaret Riley would not be a bystander. The silence she had so feared was gone, replaced by the frantic, roaring pulse of a fight she had to win. The man with the gun chuckled a low, ugly sound. "Your watch, lady. Your time just ran out." He raised the pistol, aiming not at her but at the container door. Move. Margaret's mind raced. There was no room for negotiation, no appeal to reason. There was only the raw, immediate threat. As the man's finger tightened on the trigger, she did the only thing she could. She acted on instinct, on a memory of Frank coaching a rookie on how to handle a standoff. Create a distraction. Change the dynamic. Blitz. She commanded, her voice ringing with an authority that surprised even herself. Washer, watch. It was a command from his old life, a word he hadn't heard in years. It was the trigger. Blitz didn't hesitate. He exploded from his coiled stance, a blur of black muscle and righteous fury. He ignored the gunman instead, launching himself at the second man, the one who held a tire iron loosely in his hand. The sheer shock of the attack was total. The man yelped as 90 pounds of determined shepherd slammed into his chest, sending him staggering backward. The gunman, startled, swiveled toward the dog. It was the opening Margaret needed. With a surge of adrenaline, she swung her oak cane in a wide, desperate arc, striking the man's wrist with a solid crack. The gun clattered to the gravel. He howled in pain and rage, clutching his injured hand. "Get in the truck." The first man screamed at his partner, who was scrambling away from Blitz's snapping jaws. They tumbled back into the SUV, the gunman grabbing his weapon from the ground as he retreated. The engine roared, and the vehicle sped away, fishtailing in the loose dirt, before vanishing into the night. Silence descended, broken only by Blitz's heavy panting and Margaret's own ragged breaths. The immediate threat was gone, but the larger problem remained. She turned to the container. "It's okay," she called out. "They're gone. You can come out." The door creaked open, and a young man stumbled out, collapsing to his knees. He was in his late 20s, with a tech nerd t-shirt now soaked in blood from a crude makeshift bandage around his abdomen. His face was pale as death. "Thank you," he rasped, his eyes wide with fear and pain. They'll be back, with more men." "Who are you?" Margaret asked, kneeling beside him, her teacher's instinct to take charge kicking in. "Name's Jake," he whispered. "Jake Rossi. I was a data analyst for Alderman Thomas Corrigan." The name was instantly recognizable. Corrigan was a rising star in Chicago politics, a charismatic reformer. "He's not what he seems," Jake breathed. "He's owned by the syndicate. I found the ledger, the real one. All the payoffs, the shell companies, everything. I copied it." He tapped a small, rugged flash drive hanging from a lanyard around his neck. "This is my life insurance and my death warrant." The complication was staggering. This wasn't a street crime. This was a conspiracy that reached into the heart of the city's government. They weren't just in danger, they were standing on a political landmine. Margaret knew they couldn't stay. She helped Jake to his feet, his arm slung over her shoulder, and they began the slow, painful trek back toward the streetlights, Blitz circling them protectively. Her small bungalow, once a sanctuary of silence, now felt like the most dangerous place in the world. She got Jake inside and onto her sofa, the floral pattern quickly staining crimson. She was a history teacher, not a nurse. His wound was deep, far beyond her abilities. She had to call for help. But who could she trust if the city's top officials were corrupt? Calling 911 could be a death sentence. She remembered Frank's partner, Officer Miller, the man who had given her Blitz. He had retired, but he had given her the number of one cop he trusted implicitly, a detective in the robbery homicide division. "If you're ever in a real jam, Maggie, a jam you can't see a way out of, you call this number. You ask for Detective Kovsky." Her hands shaking, she dialed. A gruff, sleep-deprived voice answered. "Kovsky?" Margaret poured out the story. The dog, the container, the wounded analyst, the flash drive. She expected disbelief, dismissal. Instead, there was a long, heavy silence. Mamkovsky said finally, his voice now tight with professional gravity. "My partner and I are 20 minutes out. Do not under any circumstances open the door for anyone else. Barricade it if you can, and keep that dog close." The line went dead. The wait was the longest 20 minutes of Margaret's life. Every creak of the old house, every car that passed on the street sent a jolt of fear through her. Blitz seemed to sense it, positioning himself squarely in front of the door, his body a silent, formidable barricade. Jake was fading, his breathing shallow. The stakes had escalated from a fight for survival to a race against time. They weren't just protecting a man anymore, they were protecting the truth. And in a city like Chicago, the truth was a treasure worth killing for. Detective Stankovsky was a man built like a filing cabinet, with a face that looked like it had lost a bare-knuckle brawl with a Chicago winter. He and his younger, sharper-dressed partner, Detective Lena Petrova, didn't use the doorbell. A quiet, firm knock followed by Kovsky's gravelly voice announcing their presence was all that preceded their entry. They stepped into Margaret's cozy living room, and their professional calm immediately fractured. Petrova's eyes widened at the sight of Jake Rossi bleeding out on the floral sofa, while Kovsky's gaze fell on the black dog standing guard. "I'll be damned." Kovsky breathed a flicker of recognition in his tired eyes. "Blitz." The dog's ears twitched. He looked at the detective, a low rumble starting in his chest, but he didn't move from his post. "It's okay, boy," Margaret said softly, placing a hand on Blitz's back. "They're here to help." The next few minutes were a blur of efficient, controlled action. Petrova, who had paramedic training, immediately went to work on Jake, applying a proper pressure bandage and checking his vitals. "He needs a surgeon now," she stated flatly. "This isn't a hospital, and we can't take him to one. His name will be flagged the second it hits the system." This was the stark confirmation of their reality. They were operating outside the system because the system itself was compromised. Kovsky stood over Jake, his expression grim. "Alderman Corrigan," he said more to himself than anyone else. "We've had whispers about him for years, never anything solid, always insulated." He looked at the flash drive still clutched in Jake's hand. This changes the game. This was the turning point. The arrival of the detectives shifted the entire dynamic. Margaret was no longer alone, but their confirmation of the conspiracy also solidified the terrifying scope of the danger. They were now allies in a war against a deeply entrenched enemy. Kovsky laid out the situation with brutal honesty. Corrigan's power comes from two places: his public image as a reformer and his private alliance with the syndicate's top enforcer, a man named Marcus Thorne. Thorne is the one who handles Corrigan's dirty work. He's who sent those men after you. He looked at Margaret. "You and your dog made a very powerful, very violent man, very angry. The decision made in that room was the point of no return. They couldn't hand the evidence over to the DA's office or the FBI's local field office. Corrigan had connections everywhere. Kovsky had one contact. He trusted a federal prosecutor with the Department of Justice's Public Integrity Section in Washington, D.C. They needed to get the drive and their witness out of Chicago. "There's a private air service for medical transports at a small airfield in DuPage County, Petrova," said, thinking aloud. "No commercial manifests. We can get him on a flight, get him to Walter Reed. They can treat him and hold him as a material witness." The plan was audacious, bordering on insane. It meant smuggling a critically wounded man across 50 miles of hostile territory, hunted by both the mob and potentially corrupt law enforcement. Margaret's role underwent its final crucial transformation. She was no longer a bystander or even just a protector. She was now a co-conspirator, an active player in a high-stakes gambit. Her quiet bungalow was the nerve center of the operation. Her knowledge of the city's back roads, gleaned from decades of living there, became a tactical asset. "The main highways will be watched," she said, her voice steady. She pointed to a framed map of Cook County on her wall, a relic of her teaching days. "But if we take Archer Avenue cut through the forest preserves here, we can avoid most of the traffic cameras." Kovsky and Petrova exchanged a look. They were seeing her not as a fragile old woman, but as a sharp, clear-headed strategist. "All right," Kovsky agreed. "Petrova, you drive your unmarked car with Mr. Rossi. I'll follow in my vehicle with Mrs. Riley and the dog. We'll be your shadow. If we get separated, we all meet at the airfield, no matter what." The objective was clear. The alliances were forged. As they prepared to move, carrying a now semi-conscious Jake Rossi out the back door into the pre-dawn chill, Margaret felt a profound sense of finality. The quiet life she had known was gone forever. She was a 72-year-old history teacher who had declared war on the most powerful forces in her city. It was terrifying. It was reckless. And for the first time in a very long time, she felt truly, undeniably alive. The journey to DuPage County was a masterclass in tension. Every pair of headlights in the rearview mirror, every police cruiser passed on a side street was a potential threat. Petrova drove with a smooth, focused urgency, Jake pale and still in the passenger seat. In the car behind, Kovsky drove with practiced calm, while Margaret sat in the passenger seat, Blitz, a heavy, reassuring weight in the back. The dog seemed to understand the gravity of the situation, sitting perfectly still. His amber eyes fixed on the car ahead, a silent, furry escort. They made it through the city's sleeping suburbs without incident. The forest preserves, as Margaret had predicted, were dark and deserted. But as they emerged back onto the main roads approaching the airfield, their luck ran out. Kovsky's phone buzzed. It was Petrova. "We've got a tail," she said, her voice strained. "Black sedan. Been with us for the last 5 miles. They're being smart, keeping their distance." "Understood," Kovsky grunted. "Keep driving. Lead them toward the industrial park just south of the airfield. More room to maneuver." He glanced at Margaret. "Here we go." The chase was not a Hollywood spectacle of screeching tires and explosions. It was a cold, calculated dance of predators and prey. The black sedan grew more aggressive, closing the distance, trying to force Petrova's car off the road. Kovsky in turn used his heavier vehicle to block and screen a sheepdog protecting his flock. They swerved into the deserted industrial park, a maze of empty warehouses and loading docks. The sedan followed, and a second one appeared, cutting off their exit. They were boxed in. The cars screeched to a halt. This time there were 4 men led by a figure who stepped out of the lead car with an air of cold authority. He was tall, dressed in a tailored suit, his face handsome, but for the deadness in his eyes. Detective Kovsky, the man said, his voice calm and almost pleasant. "Marcus Thorne. Alderman Corrigan sends his regards. He'd like his property back, the analyst and the drive. Give them to us, and we'll let you and the old woman walk away." "Not happening." Thorne. Kovsky growled, his hand on his holstered weapon. Thorne sighed, a theatrical display of disappointment. "I was afraid you'd say that." He nodded to his men. "No witnesses." The night erupted in gunfire. Kovsky and Petrova were professionals using their vehicles for cover, returning fire with disciplined bursts. But they were outmanned and outgunned. Margaret, huddled on the floor of the car, felt a terrifying sense of helplessness. This was a world she didn't belong in, a battle she couldn't fight. This was how it ended. The thought was not filled with fear, but with a profound, aching sadness. She had tried, and she had failed. A bullet shattered the back window, showering them with glass. Blitz yelped not in pain, but in fury. In the chaotic exchange of fire, one of Thorne's men tried to flank them, creeping along the side of a warehouse. Before Kovsky could react, Blitz launched himself through the shattered window, a black cannonball of righteous rage. He hit the gunman low and hard, his jaws locking onto the man's gun arm. The man screamed, his rifle discharging harmlessly into the sky. The distraction bought them seconds. Petrova, seeing an opening, managed to shoot out the tires on one of the sedans. But Marcus Thorne was methodical. He wasn't joining the firefight. He was walking calmly toward Petrova's car, his own gun raised, aiming for the helpless man inside. This was Margaret's dark night of the soul. She was old. She was terrified. Her weapon was a walking stick lying useless on the car floor. But as she saw Thorne advancing on Jake, something inside her broke. It was the last vestige of fear, the last shred of her identity as a helpless bystander. She would not watch another person die. With a cry that was part terror and part rage, she scrambled out of the car, grabbing a heavy cast-iron tire wrench from the trunk's emergency kit. She ran, her movements clumsy, but driven by a primal need to protect screaming Thorne's name. He turned, his expression one of pure disbelief that this old woman would dare to challenge him. That moment of surprise was his undoing. Kovsky, seeing his chance, fired 2 rounds. Thorne staggered, clutching a wound in his shoulder, his shot going wide. He stared at Margaret with pure hatred before diving back into his remaining vehicle, which sped away into the darkness. The other gunmen, their leader gone, quickly followed suit. Silence fell once more. They were alive, battered, terrified, but alive. Petrova and Kovsky had minor grazes. Blitz had a shallow cut on his flank from the broken glass. But they were alive. As the adrenaline faded, however, the grim reality set in. Thorne had escaped. He knew where they were going. The airfield was no longer safe. Their plan was in ruins. They were stranded in an industrial park with a critically wounded man, a compromised escape route, and the certain knowledge that the city's most dangerous man was now hunting them with a personal vengeance. The night was far from over. "He'll be waiting for us at the airfield," Kovsky said, reloading his weapon with grim precision. The plan's bust. They stood in the cold, cavernous silence of the warehouse where they'd taken shelter. Jake was unconscious, his breathing dangerously faint. Despair was a tangible thing in the air. Then Margaret, her mind casting back through decades of Chicago history, had an idea. It was born of desperation, a wild, improbable gambit. "The old Union stockyards," she said, her voice cutting through the gloom. "Corrigan is giving the keynote address at the redevelopment gala there tomorrow night. It's his signature project. The press, the mayor, everyone will be there." Kovsky stared at her. "You want to walk into the lion's den?" "We don't walk in," she countered, her idea taking shape. "We crash the party. They're expecting us to run to hide. They'll never expect us to walk right up to the stage. You can't make a witness disappear in front of 200 people and a dozen news cameras." The plan was insane. It was also their only option. The next 24 hours were a blur of tense preparation. Petrova found a doctor she could trust, a retired army medic who patched Jake up enough to keep him alive. Kovsky called in every favor he had, arranging for a small, loyal team of officers to be discreetly positioned at the event. The climax came under the glittering chandeliers of the restored Stockyard Pavilion. While Corrigan was on stage delivering a charismatic speech about Chicago's future, Petrova, disguised as a paramedic, wheeled a conscious but weak Jake Rossi through a service entrance. At the same time, Kovsky, Margaret, and Blitz entered through the main doors dressed as unassuming guests. Blitz, wearing an official-looking service dog vest Kovsky had procured, stayed perfectly at her heel. As Corrigan reached the crescendo of his speech, Kovsky gave the signal. Petrova pushed Jake's wheelchair toward the stage from one side. From the other, Kovsky with Margaret and Blitz approached. Corrigan's eyes widened as he saw them. For a split second, his mask of confident charm slipped, revealing a flicker of pure panic. Security guards, some on Thorne's payroll, started to move in. Alderman Corrigan. Jake's voice was weak, but amplified by the microphone. It boomed through the hall. Why don't you tell them about the O'Connell street cleaning contract? Tell them about Marcus Thorne. The room fell silent. The guards hesitated, caught in the glare of the live news cameras that had all swiveled to face this new drama. One guard, loyal to Thorne, drew his weapon. Before he could aim, Blitz acted. With a sharp command from Kovsky, he launched himself forward, not to attack, but to disarm. He hit the man's arm with surgical precision, the gun flying from his grasp and skittering across the polished floor. The loyal police officers on Kovsky's signal moved in, securing the corrupt guards and forming a protective circle around the stage. It was over. Cornered, exposed, and trapped in the literal spotlight, Corrigan crumbled. The central question, would they get the truth out, had been answered with a resounding public yes. The fallout was immediate and spectacular. The Stockyard takedown led every newscast. With the flash drive in the hands of federal prosecutors and a key witness willing to testify, Alderman Corrigan's empire imploded. His arrest, along with the subsequent capture of a wounded Marcus Thorne, triggered a sweeping federal investigation that cleansed a layer of deep-seated corruption from the city's political machine. Detective Kovsky and Detective Petrova became reluctant heroes, lauded for their bravery and integrity. Jake Rossi, after a full recovery, went on to write a best-selling book about his ordeal. His career as an investigative journalist cemented forever. But the heart of the story, the part that truly captured the city's imagination, was the 72-year-old history teacher and her retired K-9. Donations poured in not just to cover Margaret's minor medical bills, but from people who simply wanted to thank her. A local contractor, a retired veteran himself, rebuilt her back porch for free. The local police department reinstated Blitz's pension, providing free veterinary care for life and a brand new, non-rickety dog bed. A few weeks later, on a bright, crisp December morning, Margaret sat on her new porch, a warm mug of tea in her hands. Blitz lay at her feet, dozing in a patch of sunlight, his flank now healed, leaving only a faint scar. The silence of her home was no longer oppressive. It was peaceful. It was earned. A car pulled up and Detective Kovsky got out. He wasn't in a suit, but a comfortable sweater. He handed Margaret a small framed certificate. It was an official commendation from the Chicago Police Department honoring the bravery of citizen Margaret Riley and K-9 Blitz. The chief insisted, Kovsky said with a rare smile. He said Frank would have been proud. Margaret's eyes welled with tears. She looked down at the sleeping dog, her partner, her family. He had come into her life as a fellow solitary soul, a creature defined by his past. But together in a storm of violence and conspiracy, they had forged a new purpose. They had reminded a cynical city that heroes can be found in the most unlikely of places, in a quiet bungalow, in a forgotten industrial yard, and in the unwavering heart of a good dog. Blitz's tail gave a sleepy thump, thump, thump against the wooden planks of the porch, a quiet, contented rhythm that was for Margaret the most beautiful sound in the world.